The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song above Mercy General's fourth-floor ICU, and Danielle Ross moved through the corridors like a ghost who'd learned to pass unnoticed. Her scrubs were the same blue-gray as everyone else's. Her badge clipped to her pocket bore only her first name and the word RN. Nobody looked twice. That was the point. That had always been the point. The tremor in her left hand came back when the Black Hawk helicopters flew overhead from Fort Bragg, 23 miles east. She'd learned to keep her hand submerged in warm water during those moments, or wrapped around a cup of coffee, or folded into the pockets of the weathered military jacket that hung in her locker like a secret. The jacket was olive drab, faded to the color of old smoke. Inside the lining, sewn with precise surgical stitches she'd taught herself in a field hospital outside Kandahar, was a unit patch. Valkyrie Squadron. She touched it once per shift, the way other people touched religious medals. 18 years of nursing. Not one person at Mercy General knew the first 6 of those years had been lived at altitude, under fire, with her hands inside other people's chests. At 11:36 a.m., the morning shift hit its rhythm. Danielle was in room for 12, changing a diabetic ulcer dressing on a 64-year-old construction foreman named Mitchell. The wound was necrotic tissue and infected margins, a surgical candidate 3 weeks ago, but Mitchell had missed his appointments. Now it was angry red, weeping fluid the color of rust. The smell beneath the old gauze was copper and decay, the specific perfume of tissue that had already begun to die. She worked with unusual speed. Gloved hand steady. She debridged the necrotic tissue with a surgical blade, removing only what was truly dead, leaving the borderline viable tissue intact. 3 precise points of contact, the blade, her left hand stabilizing the tissue, her right hand making the cuts in one practiced motion. The technique had a name in the Navy. Field surgical debridement. Combat medics learned it because in field hospitals, you didn't have the luxury of waiting for infection to declare itself. You took what was borderline and you decided, right there, whether it lived or died. The technique was faster than textbook nursing. It was also more effective. Dr. Marcus Hargrove didn't notice. He was reviewing the chart at the foot of the bed, his $5,000 watch catching the fluorescent light like a prism. The expensive kind of expensive, the kind that announced itself without needing to speak. Hargrove was the type of physician who'd been born into the right family, gone to the right schools, and never once had his competence questioned because the people questioning competence were usually people he already knew. But Danielle felt the moment shift. A man was standing in the doorway. Late 50s, weathered face, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He was wearing a military service cap, not current issue, something from 2005 or so, and his uniform bore the insignia of a hospital corpsman first class. He'd been visiting his wife in room for 16. Now he was watching Danielle's hands move across Mitchell's wound, and his expression had changed to something like recognition. Like seeing a language he'd thought he was the only one who spoke. Danielle didn't break rhythm. She finished the 3rd point of debridement, placed the blade down with a soft click against the stainless steel tray, and began applying the fresh antimicrobial dressing. Her voice stayed level, deferential, the voice she built for this work, the voice of someone who'd learned to take orders from people who'd never given her a reason to trust them. All set, Mr. Mitchell. The edges are clean now. This should start improving in 3 to 4 days. She turned to dispose of the old dressing, and the corpsman in the doorway caught her eye for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for him to nod, a single, precise movement. Not a question anymore. A recognition. His lips moved without sound, Fallujah. She looked away. Disposed of the gauze in the red biohazard bin. Click the sharps container closed. When she turned back to the door, the corpsman was already walking back toward room 416. He wouldn't say anything. Veterans didn't burn veterans. But the air around her had shifted, and she could feel the invisible mark on her chest. Someone knew. Not everything. But something. The rest of the morning moved in the rhythm she'd built for it. Vital signs. Charting. A medication pass. By early afternoon, the whispers came through the intercom that elevated Danielle's heart rate in ways she would never let show on her face. Code admission to ICU. Incoming trauma consult. A blind man arrived in a wheelchair at 2:14 p.m. Retired Marine Sergeant James Keating. Age 71. Blind since an IED detonation in Mosul 17 years ago. He was accompanied by his daughter, Sarah, who wept quietly into tissues while pushing his chair toward the open room that the nurses had prepared. His chart preceded him like a burial notice: multiple complications from untreated diabetic neuropathy. Progressive infection across both lower extremities. Necrotic tissue progression to the point where standard debridement was no longer viable. Candidates for amputation had already been dismissed by the surgical teams. He was a man the system had already written off. Room for 20, the charge nurse called to Danielle. "You've got him." Dr. Hargrove arrived within 10 minutes. He was never slow to respond when the case might be interesting, and he was never slow to respond when the case might be simple enough to refuse. Danielle watched him move through the corridor with the particular confidence of a man who'd never once been told no by people who mattered. 7 attending physicians trailed behind him like planets orbiting a sun that didn't know it was burning out its fuel. They gathered outside room 420. Danielle remained at the bedside, monitoring Keating's oxygen saturation while Sarah held her father's hand and whispered things that Danielle pretended not to hear. The official review took less than 8 minutes. Danielle watched through the glass partition as the 7 doctors flipped through Keating's chart, their faces registering the same calculation: high-risk patient. Limited surgical options. Resources that could be deployed elsewhere. Then Hargrove turned, and he opened the door to room 420 with the casual confidence of a man who'd already made his decision and had the authority to enforce it. "Mr. Keating," he began, his voice warm and regretful, the tone of someone delivering bad news to someone he was about to disappoint. "I've reviewed your case with our surgical team. 7 attending physicians. We've consulted extensively." Sarah's grip on her father's hand tightened. Danielle continued monitoring the oxygen saturation. 94%. Normal. She kept her eyes on the monitor, not on Hargrove's face, but she heard every word that came next. "The consensus is clear. You're not a surgical candidate. The risk is too high. The prognosis is too limited. And frankly, we have patients worth saving. Patients with better outcomes ahead of them. I know this isn't what you hope to hear, but it's the reality of the situation." He said it in front of his daughter. He said it in front of Danielle. He said it with the certainty of someone whose decisions were never questioned by people who mattered. Sarah made a sound like an animal in a trap. Keating's face remained still, the acceptance of someone who'd already survived one war and had no illusions about how the next battle would go. But his hand found his daughter's, and he squeezed it once. Hargrove turned back to the corridor. 7 doctors remained standing in the hallway outside the glass. One by one, over the next 3 minutes, they entered the room, approached the chart that hung at the foot of Keating's bed, and initialed the formal refusal. The first signature was confident. The second slightly less so. By the fourth, Danielle could see the hesitation, a brief moment where Dr. Patricia Chen, the youngest of the 7, looked at the chart, then at Keating, then back at the chart. But the institutional weight was already too heavy. For signatures, and the pattern was established. 5. 6. 7. The last signature belonged to an older physician, Dr. William Okonkwo, whose hand shook slightly as he wrote his initials. He was the only one who looked at Keating's face as he signed. The only one whose eyes betrayed something that wasn't certainty. The room went silent except for the ventilator's distant wheeze from the next room over, and the steady beep of the monitor registering Keating's elevated heart rate. That was the moment Danielle made the choice that would reshape everything that came after. She said nothing. She signed nothing. She simply looked at the chart, at the 7 initialed refusals, and she understood that this man had already been declared disposable by the apparatus that was supposed to save him. The apparatus had spoken. 7 voices. One unified verdict. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they were already walking away. Over the next 48 hours, Danielle was assigned to Keating's care as the floor nurse. Sarah remained almost constantly by his bedside, her grief transforming into a kind of determined presence. Danielle performed the routine tasks, vital signs every 4 hours, medication administration, dressing changes. It was during the wound care on the second day that the corpsman appeared again. His name was Marcus Holloway. He'd been a hospital corpsman first class with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. Fallujah. 2004 to 2005. He was visiting his wife in the cardiac ward, and he'd requested a walk around the floor to get some steps in, and somehow his steps had led him to room 420. "I need to check the oxygen," Danielle said quietly, approaching the bed. She was gentle, precise. She used the three-point debridement technique on Keating's foot wound, stabilizing with her left hand, blade in her right, removing the necrotic tissue with movements that had been trained into her muscle memory during her 3rd deployment. The technique was faster than standard nursing. It was also recognizable to anyone who'd seen combat medicine performed under fire. Holloway watched from the doorway, his hand on the frame. When Danielle finished, she disposed of the old gauze, and as she passed the doorway, Holloway leaned close enough to whisper words that she felt more than heard. "Only combat medics work that fast. I was a corpsman in Fallujah. I know that technique when I see it." He didn't wait for her answer. He simply turned and walked back toward his wife's room, leaving Danielle standing in the corridor with a secret that was no longer entirely her own. The corpsman's words hung in the air like shrapnel. Danielle didn't acknowledge them. She simply completed the dressing change on Keating's infected surgical wound with the same methodical precision she'd used in forward operating bases where a single tremor could mean the difference between saving a life and losing one. Her hands moved with muscle memory that predated her nursing license by a decade. Each motion exact. Economical. The kind of technique that didn't come from textbooks or simulation labs. She secured the last gauze pad and stepped back. The veteran was gone. But his recognition was not. It sat between them like a third person in the room, unspoken and dangerous. That afternoon, Danielle found herself standing in front of Dr. Hargrove's office with her hand raised to knock. She'd spent 2 hours rehearsing what to say. Not asking permission. Not requesting. Simply presenting an alternative. Because Keating's infection wasn't responding to the standard protocols. The surgical site was deteriorating. The standard approach would leave him more broken than he already was, and there was another way, a modified approach she'd seen work in field hospitals where resources were limited and improvisation was survival. She knocked. Hargrove looked up from his desk with the expression of a man interrupted mid-important thought. His office smelled of expensive cologne and leather, the scent of someone who believed his surroundings reflected his value. "Dr. Hargrove, I wanted to discuss Sergeant Keating's case." He gestured to the chair across from his desk without speaking. Made her wait while he finished typing an email. This was theater. Control demonstrated through small cruelties. The infection at the surgical site, Danielle continued quietly, responds poorly to conventional debridement. But there's a modified approach, gradual tissue removal with enzymatic preparation instead of aggressive excision. I've seen it work in. In what context have you seen this, Nurse Ross? The way he said her name made it clear he'd already decided the answer. Field surgical teams use it when conventional resources aren't available. Field surgical teams. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness. Interesting. And how many board certifications in surgical procedure do you possess? None. But? None. I thought not. See, what I possess are 7, count them, 7, attending physicians who have reviewed Sergeant Keating's case and determined he is not a surgical candidate. 7 doctors, Nurse Ross. Not 1. Not 2. 7. And none of them, despite their extensive training, suggested this field hospital technique of yours. He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked like a judge's bench. Perhaps our little Band-Aid dispenser here thinks she knows better than 7 board-certified surgeons. She didn't respond. Didn't flinch. Didn't correct him. The silence that followed was a weapon. She let him fill it with his own assumptions about her submission. "I'm glad we're in agreement," Hargrove said, putting his glasses back on. "You're a capable nurse, Danielle. Truly. But you have your role and we have ours. Stay in your lane." By late morning, the written warning appeared on the hospital's main bulletin board in the break room where every staff member would see it. Printed on official letterhead, laminated, posted where even patients' families might notice. Written warning. Nurse Dee Ross. Overstepping scope of practice and insubordination during physician rounds. Date, today. Signature, Dr. Hargrove. No specifics. No context. Just the accusation, public and permanent. Danielle read it once while passing between units. Didn't stop. Didn't linger. Just noted the tactic and kept moving. This was intimidation meant to be witnessed by everyone. A message to the staff: support the physician or face consequences. The strategy worked faster than he probably expected. She entered the break room at 12:08 p.m. with a container of soup and sat at the center table like she always did. The room held for nurses and a tech. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Someone's fork paused halfway to their mouth. One by one, they gathered their things. Their food. Their phones. They left without looking at her, without excuses, without even the pretense of civility. Within 90 seconds, the break room was empty except for Danielle and her soup. She sat alone in the fluorescent silence. The industrial clock on the wall ticked with the precision of a metronome. 12:49 p.m. She opened the container. Steam rose from the broth. The smell of chicken and herbs filled the empty space where conversation had been. The door opened. Dr. Hargrove walked in like an actor taking the stage. He moved to the coffee machine with the casual confidence of someone who owned the room. Poured his coffee. Adjusted the cup. Then, speaking to no one, or rather, speaking to everyone, to the audience of empty chairs and watching eyes he knew were elsewhere, listening, he said, "Some people just don't know their place, do they? Some people think they can question protocol. Question authority. Suggest they know better." Danielle took one measured breath. Just one. She didn't tremble. She didn't look away. She didn't offer an explanation or an apology or any of the responses that might have satisfied him. Instead, a single tear escaped her left eye, not from sadness, not from shame, but from the enormous effort required to contain what was moving beneath her composure. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. Without flinching. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. And then she spoke, her voice so quiet Hargrove had to lean in to hear it, though that was precisely the point. "Someone trained me that we don't leave people behind. That every patient deserves to be fought for, no matter the odds." She paused. 1 beat. 2. "I can see you had different instructors." Hargrove's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being challenged. Wasn't used to having his authority questioned, especially not with such devastating calm. He opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and left the break room without another word, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Danielle finished her soup alone. By evening, she made a decision that had nothing to do with written warnings or professional consequences or the institutional weight of 7 physicians' refusal. She walked to Keating's room where his daughter Sarah sat beside his bed, her hand resting on his arm. The blind Marine's daughter looked up with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to hope. "I'm going to be his primary nurse," Danielle said simply. "Regardless of what the physicians have decided." Sarah's breath caught. "They said." "I know what they said. I'm telling you what I'm doing." Her voice carried the kind of authority that doesn't announce itself. "We're going to try the modified approach. And I'll be here every shift to monitor him. Someone will be here." She didn't explain her background. Didn't reference field hospitals or combat medicine or anything that might raise questions she wasn't ready to answer. She simply made a commitment. A promise. The kind that gets made in quiet moments and then gets kept regardless of the cost. Keating's hand reached toward her voice. "Thank you, nurse." "I'm going on break," she said dryly, and something almost like a smile crossed the Marine's face, the first likeness he'd shown since he arrived. 2 days passed. Danielle moved through Mercy General like she always did, invisible and precise, a figure in scrubs that the staff had learned to avoid. The written warning remained on the break room board. No one took it down. No one challenged it. The institutional machinery of Hargrove's authority hummed along undisturbed. But at 2:36 in the morning on the third day, Keating's room became a battlefield. The monitor screamed first, high-pitched alarm, heart rate climbing, oxygen saturation plummeting like a stone down a well. Danielle was there before the second alarm sounded. She'd been doing rounds. She was always nearby. She was always listening. His breathing had changed. The quality of it. His chest wasn't expanding properly. His blind eyes rolled back and his trachea, she could see the deviation even in the low light. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, building pressure, collapsing the lung. 3 minutes until cardiac arrest. Maybe 4 if he was lucky. Dr. Chen arrived at the door looking like he'd been yanked from sleep. He had. His shirt wasn't fully buttoned. His hair stood at odd angles. "We need needle decompression," Danielle said. "Now." "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." "That's not, we should call." "He'll be dead before we call anyone." Her hands were already moving. Muscle memory from Kandahar. From forward operating base surgical teams. From the moment she'd held a lance corporal's lung in her hands and remembered how to save lives when every system failed. The 14-gauge catheter was assembled. The prep was done. The angle was perfect because her hands remembered the angle. Dr. Chen was still frozen when she inserted the needle. The hiss of air escaping filled the room, a sound like the breaking of a seal, like pressure being released, like the difference between living and not living. Her hands knew this sound. Had heard it before. Had made it happen deliberately, methodically, with the kind of precision that came from training and trauma and the muscle memory of having done it under fire. Keating gasped. His chest expanded. The oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, stable. Dr. Chen was staring at her like she'd just materialized in his room. "That's not protocol," he said. "You're a nurse. There are forms." "There are." "There's a patient who's breathing," Danielle said quietly, checking the catheter placement one final time. Movement at the doorway caught her attention. The corpsman from days ago. He'd heard the alarm, come running, and now he stood in the threshold watching her like she was something he couldn't quite believe he was seeing. His lips moved silently around a single word she couldn't quite hear, though she somehow knew, exactly what he was saying. Valkyrie. That was the call sign they'd given her in Kandahar. The name that wasn't supposed to follow her out of that war. She checked the catheter one more time and didn't acknowledge him. Just continued working like she always did. Like her past was still buried deep enough that it couldn't hurt anyone. It was 6:12 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove arrived for rounds. The incident report was already on his desk, filed by Dr. Chen with trembling hands and a statement that read like a confession of his own inadequacy. A nurse. Performing needle decompression. Without physician authorization. Against protocol. He read it twice. And the machinery of institutional power began to turn. The ICU fell silent at 02 for 7 hours. Danielle stood at the bedside of James Keating, her hand steady as she checked the ventilator settings. The machine wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a sound she'd heard 10,000 times before. 2 days had passed since she'd taken his case. 2 days of whispered conversations and hostile charts, and the weight of 7 physicians' refusal pressing down like a physical thing. But Keating was stable. His oxygen saturation held at 94%. His vital signs traced a steady line across the monitor. Then the line went wrong. The beeping accelerated. Once, twice, 3 times in rapid succession. Danielle's eyes snapped to the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 92. 88. 81. His blood pressure climbing fast, the numbers climbing like a siren climbing toward danger. The patient's chest moved only on one side now, the ventilator pushing air but only half the lungs receiving it. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen it twice before. Both times in Kandahar. Both times seconds mattered. She moved toward the crash cart, but the on-call resident, a thin young man named Patterson who looked like he'd trained his entire career on PowerPoint slides, was already frozen beside the bed. His hands hung at his sides. His mouth opened without sound. He was looking at the monitor like it might explain itself if he stared long enough. The oxygen saturation hit 76. Danielle didn't call for help. She didn't wait for orders. She opened the emergency crash kit with one hand and pulled a 14-gauge angiocath with the other. Her movements belonged to someone else now, someone trained at Camp Lejeune and deployed twice to Helmand Province. Someone whose hands had learned in dirt and dust what textbooks could never teach. The second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She swabbed the skin with antiseptic, the sharp smell of iodine cutting through the recirculated hospital air, and found the landmarks with her fingertips. "What are you doing?" Patterson's voice cracked like adolescence. "That's not protocol." "That's not." She didn't answer. She didn't have time to answer. The needle went in. The hiss of air. A long, desperate wheeze of pressure escaping. The ventilator suddenly pushing air into lungs that could finally receive it. Oxygen saturation climbing. 78. 84. 90. 93. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Keating's body went rigid, then slack. His breathing synchronized with the machine. The numbers on the monitor stopped their desperate climb and settled into the comfortable range of the living. The room seemed to exhale along with the patient. "Code blue is called by the physician," Patterson whispered. His hands were trembling now, shaking like they belonged to a different person. "You can't just, that's scope of practice violation. That's assault. That's unlicensed practice of medicine." Danielle was already documenting. 7 vital signs. Oxygen saturation recovery timeline. Procedure type and time. Her handwriting was precise, steady, unapologetic. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd filled out field surgical reports under fire. She didn't look at Patterson. "Call respiratory. Call the attending. Get a chest X-ray before sepsis sets in. Unless you want to explain to his daughter why you let him die." Patterson left. The moment he was gone, Danielle sat down in the visitor chair beside Keating's bed and pressed her hand against her own chest, right over the spot where her heart was working its way back down from combat speed. No trembling. No tears. No retreat. This was the price of stepping outside the lines. This was what happened when you chose a patient over protocol. She'd known it would cost her. She just hadn't known it would happen so fast. But that wasn't the worst part. By 06:45 hours, the day shift was arriving. Danielle was still at her charting station, completing the incident report with clinical precision. 7 pages of documentation. Every decision justified. Every procedure explained. Every step traceable. She heard the footsteps first, hard-soled shoes on polished tile, the sound of someone walking with authority that had nothing to do with medicine. Then she heard the voice. "You need to read this." Dr. Hargrove held the incident report like it was physical evidence. His voice carried the tone of a man presenting proof of guilt to a room full of witnesses. 5 nurses had arrived for the day shift. 3 residents. 2 respiratory therapists. They all heard. They all stopped moving. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Unauthorized invasive procedure performed by unlicensed personnel. That's her. That's what happened at 0247 this morning. Danielle looked up from her documentation. Her eyes met his across the distance of the nursing station. She said nothing. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't defend the procedure or cite the emergency exception or remind him that Keating's oxygen saturation had been 76% and falling. The silence between them stretched like a live wire. Finally, Hargrove smiled. Not a smile of humor. A smile of victory already won. You just ended your career, Band-Aid. He said it quietly, just for her. I'd clear out your locker if I were you. He turned and walked toward the ICU, incident report in hand like a trophy. The day shift staff moved back to their work, but the air had changed. Danielle could feel it, the invisible wall rising. She was already becoming background. Already disappearing from their conversations. Already the thing they didn't speak to or about. By 1100 hours, the machinery of institutional power was running at full speed. Danielle was in the break room, attempting something normal like coffee, when the nursing director's secretary appeared. Conference room. Now. No, please. No explanation. Danielle set down her cup and walked the corridors that had been hers just 12 hours ago. This time they felt foreign. This time every face she passed looked away. The conference room smelled like leather chairs and air conditioning. The nursing director, a woman named Mrs. Chen who'd never been unkind but who'd never been kind either, sat across the table from a woman in a grey suit and a man Danielle recognized as the hospital's attorney. Mrs. Chen's hands were folded on the table. She wouldn't meet Danielle's eyes. The state licensing board has concerns, the woman in grey said. Her name tag read, Investigator Walsh. Her voice was the kind of neutral that meant everything was already decided. We've received a report of unauthorized practice. We'll need to review your training records, your certifications, your employment history. Specifically, we need to understand your scope of practice and any pattern of overstepping. Danielle sat down. The chair was hard plastic, the kind that encouraged confession. She didn't confess. She didn't speak at all. She'd learned in Kandahar that silence was a weapon when you had nothing left to lose. Additionally, the attorney said, Dr. Hargrove has contacted your nursing school. He's requested complete access to your educational records. He's also been in touch with 3 of your clinical instructors about any concerns they might have had during your program. At 14:30, it was over. Mrs. Chen's voice shook slightly when she read the suspension notice. Effective immediately. Pending investigation. Your access to hospital systems will be revoked. You'll return any hospital property. A representative will walk you out. There was a security guard standing by the door. A young man named Marcus who'd always smiled when she passed. He didn't smile now. Danielle cleared her locker in 4 minutes. Her white coat. Her stethoscope. The small container of hand cream she kept in the back corner. A photo of her son David from his high school graduation, his arm around her shoulders, both of them pretending everything was normal. She put it all in a cardboard box. Marcus carried it when she wasn't looking. She followed him down the main corridor of Mercy General Hospital, the place she'd worked for 5 years building a life from the pieces of an old one. The staff watched her pass. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody even looked at her. Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway near the main entrance, arms folded across his chest, watching her like a hunter watching prey that had finally stopped running. His face arranged itself into an expression of professional concern, the kind of face designed for the audience of colleagues who were pretending not to notice. I did try to warn you, he said quietly. Some people aren't meant for this work. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't speed up or slow down. She carried herself out of Mercy General with the same steady pace she'd used walking through the gates of Camp Lejeune 13 years ago. The parking lot was bright with midday sun. Her car was exactly where she'd left it when her shift started at 2,200 hours. Her hands didn't shake when she opened the driver's side door. Her voice didn't crack when she texted her son that she was coming home early. But when she pulled into the driveway at 1,520 hours, when she climbed the porch steps of the small house where she and David had been building something peaceful and invisible, she felt the weight of it all finally land. The front door closed behind her. The kitchen was quiet. Rain had started falling outside, pattering against the windows like 1,000 small accusations. At 1600, David found her at the kitchen table. He was 16 and handsome and entirely unaware that his mother had been a senior chief petty officer. That she'd served 2 tours in Kandahar. That she'd learned to save lives in ways that textbooks never taught. That she'd just been escorted out of a hospital for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. Mom. His voice carried the tone of someone seeing their parent for the first time and realizing they didn't recognize them at all. Why are you home? Are you okay? What happened? Danielle looked at her son. She looked at the kitchen table with its scatter of his homework. She looked at the photograph on the refrigerator of the 2 of them at the beach last summer, both of them smiling, both of them pretending to be ordinary people. The words caught in her throat. How could she explain? How could she tell him that the quiet life she'd built was burning down? That the choice she'd made to disappear had followed her here? That silence could be weaponized against you by someone with power and malice and 7 physicians on speed dial. Nothing, sweetheart, she said. Her voice was steady. Controlled. The voice of someone who'd learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. Just a long shift. I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. And they both knew it. The silence at the kitchen table was the kind that comes from knowing too much and saying nothing. David sat across from her, still in his junior year hoodie, backpack slouched by the door where he dropped it when he found her there, found her at 3:53 in the afternoon, still in the grey scrubs she'd worn to Mercy General that morning, her shift supposedly running until 11. The steam from her untouched coffee had long gone cold, leaving a film-like skin on dark water. He'd known something was wrong the moment he saw her hands. Nurses' hands are supposed to move with purpose. Hers were absolutely still. Mom. His voice cracked on the single syllable. 17 years old, already taller than her, and when he spoke it was with the vulnerability of a kid who understood the exact moment his mother stopped being invincible. What happened? Danielle couldn't answer. Not because she didn't want to. Because the truth lived in a locked box labeled classified, and that box had been sealed the day she walked away from the Navy. She'd spent 8 years building a different life, a quiet life, a small life, a life where nobody asked questions and nobody looked too close. She'd changed her name on her nursing license from Ross to something safer. She'd moved to Raleigh. She'd become the kind of woman who showed up, did her job, went home. She'd become invisible. Her son deserved better than invisible. But her son also deserved a mother who didn't wake him up at 3 in the morning with nightmares about IED checkpoints in Sanjan Valley. David, she reached for words and found none. The kitchen light buzzed with that particular fluorescent hum that makes time feel thinner. I made a choice today. What kind of choice gets you sent home at 4 o'clock? He sat down across from her, pulling the chair close. He smelled like the high school gym and adolescent worry. Did someone get hurt? Are you hurt? The question nearly broke her. She looked at her hands, at the calluses still visible after 8 years of civilian nursing, at the scar tissue along her left palm from a field surgical kit that exploded in Kandahar, at the tremor she'd learned to suppress years ago but that lived underneath everything she did. These hands had saved 3 Marines under fire. These hands had held pressure on a wound while a dust storm tried to bury them all. These hands had performed emergency surgery on a stretcher in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter doing 140 knots toward forward operating base Shank. And today, these hands had performed needle decompression on James Keating while he flatlined at 0247 in the morning. There's a patient. She kept her voice level. A retired Marine. He came to the hospital and needed help that other doctors wouldn't give him. So you helped him. So I helped him. David waited. He was learning already that stories with his mother required patience. And now you're in trouble. Danielle nodded once. It was all she could manage. The phone call had come at 0645. The hospital's HR director, her voice careful and official. Danielle, I'm going to need you to bring your badge and ID to the office before your shift begins. There's been an incident report. An incident. As if what happened in that room at 0247 could be reduced to paperwork and liability assessment. As if saving a man's life was something that required incident reports. She'd arrived at 0830 and found them waiting. Not just HR. A woman in a pressed navy blazer with a state licensing board insignia clipped to her collar. The investigator's smile was professionally blank. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. The use of her rank, her real rank, had frozen the air in the hallway. Nobody at Mercy General knew that title. Nobody knew that she'd been anything other than a competent floor nurse with steady hands and a gift for difficult patients. I'm going to ask you some questions about your credentials, the investigator said, opening a leather folder. Your nursing school transcripts, your certifications, your previous employment history. We've received some concerns from Dr. Harrison Hargrove about gaps in your background. About whether your credentials are authentic. Gaps. Danielle thought about the 8-year gap in her resume. The missing years. The decade she couldn't account for without opening doors she'd nailed shut. Military service wasn't a gap. It was a canyon. It was the kind of canyon you didn't bridge by accident. By 0900, the investigator had called 2 of her nursing school references. By 1015, Dr. Hargrove had called the other 5, his voice tight and accusatory over the phone line his office assistant had overheard. What did you miss about this woman? What background check failed? What credentials are questionable? The panic in his voice had been exquisite. Not concern for the patient. Panic about liability. Panic about the fact that a suspended nurse had just saved a man he'd already written off, and that save was a mirror reflecting his own failure. By 1100, she was being escorted out of Mercy General by Marcus, the security guard who worked the north entrance. He was a big man with kind eyes and the careful movements of someone who understood what it meant to carry trauma. He'd never said anything when he'd watched her perform that needle decompression. He'd just held the door at midnight and looked away. Now he wouldn't meet her eyes either. I'm sorry, Danielle. I'm just following orders. The walk from the 3rd floor to the security office to the parking garage felt like moving through water. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent song. A code blue announcement came over the intercom somewhere in the building, a patient dying while Danielle walked out. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Not without breaking something inside her that she'd spent 8 years cementing back together. Her badge. Her ID. Her employee handbook. All of it went into a manila envelope with her name on it in hours' careful handwriting. You're suspended pending an investigation, the director had said, avoiding eye contact. You violated the terms of your employment contract by performing medical procedures outside your scope of practice. You're unauthorized to return to this facility until the investigation concludes. Unauthorized. As if Danielle Ross, decorated Senior Chief Petty Officer, needed authorization to save a dying man. But that woman wasn't supposed to exist anymore. That woman had retired. That woman had hung up her utility belt and her rank and her call sign and stepped into a life where people died sometimes and you documented it and moved on and nobody had to explain why 7 doctors had decided together that one life wasn't worth the effort. I don't understand, David said now, his voice small in a way that broke her more than any investigator's questions could have. What did you do wrong? Danielle closed her eyes. The question was impossible. The answer was impossible. The truth was that she'd done everything right, and the institution that employed her couldn't tolerate that because it meant admitting they'd all done everything wrong. I saved someone's life, she said quietly. In a way that doctors decided wasn't appropriate. So they fired you. Suspended. Pending investigation. David's face cycled through confusion to anger to something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of understanding that the world wasn't arranged the way he'd thought it was. That sometimes people in power could be wrong, and sometimes being wrong meant eliminating the people who made that wrongness visible. That's not fair, he said. No. Danielle picked up her cold coffee and set it down again. It's not. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and steady. He had her hands, she realized. The same hands that held pressure. The same hands that didn't shake. Are you going to be okay? The question hung between them like a live wire. Danielle thought about the 8 years of anonymity, the careful construction of a small life in a small city where nobody asked questions about her past. She'd done that deliberately. She'd signed an NDA the size of a novel when she'd left the Navy. She'd agreed that certain things, certain operations, certain capabilities, certain decorations, would remain classified. She'd agreed to be invisible. She'd thought invisibility would protect her. But silence had become a weapon. Her own carefully constructed privacy was now evidence of something questionable, something that needed investigating, something that Dr. Hargrove could weaponize because nobody knew the truth and the truth was classified and classified meant hidden and hidden meant suspicious. I don't know, she told her son, because that was the only honest answer she had left. The rain started around dusk, hammering the kitchen windows with the intensity of something furious. Danielle watched it streak the glass while David did his homework at the other end of the table, his presence a kind of anchor she hadn't known she needed. Outside, Raleigh was moving forward, people going to dinner, going to work, going to their beds with their jobs intact and their careers unraveling from invisible threads they couldn't see. She'd spent 8 years running from one war. Now she was in another one, and this time her enemy wasn't someone she could see coming. This time her enemy was the silence she'd promised to keep, the secret she'd agreed to hold, the identity she'd agreed to bury. The price of that agreement was standing in front of her teenage son at a kitchen table with her career in suspension and her future weaponized against her by a man who'd never be able to touch what she actually was because what she actually was remained classified, locked away, untouchable, and completely useless in a hearing where the only defense she had was the truth she wasn't allowed to tell. The board convened 3 days later in the hospital conference room at Mercy General, its mahogany table reflecting the fluorescent light like still water. Dr. Hargrove sat with the confidence of a man who'd never been touched by consequences, his posture erect beside the hospital attorney, his fingers drumming a rhythm that sounded like a countdown clock nobody else could hear. The chair across from him sat empty, the chair meant for Danielle, because suspension meant she didn't get to speak, didn't get to defend, didn't get to exist in these rooms anymore. The board members shuffled papers with the careful efficiency of people who'd already decided nothing. But the doors at the back of the conference room opened, and what entered was something nobody expected. Sergeant James Keating was wheeled in by a volunteer in a blue vest, and the room went rigid. He wore his dress blues, the fabric pressed sharp enough to cut, medals arranged in perfect rows across his chest. But what stopped every conversation mid-sentence was the jacket he carried, weathered leather, salt-stained from years of Pacific wind, worn soft by time and salt spray. He held it open as the volunteer positioned his wheelchair at the head of the table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command even in blindness. She wouldn't tell you herself, so I will. He paused, his sightless eyes somehow finding Danielle's presence in the room. His fingers found the lining of the jacket and pulled it open to reveal the faded unit patch, Navy SEAL Delivery Vehicle Team 1, the Valkyrie emblem still visible despite the decades. Her name is Valkyrie, and she saved my life twice in 1 week. The words hit like a detonation. Her teenage son stood from the visitor chairs at the back of the room, his voice cracking across his words like ice breaking under weight. Mom? You're a senior chief petty officer. The question hung in the air, and Danielle's hand moved to her scrub pocket, muscle memory reaching for the challenge coin she'd kept there for 18 years, a small circle of brass that represented everything she'd refused to be anymore. She didn't nod. She didn't cry. She met her son's eyes with the same devastating calm she'd aimed at Hargrove weeks ago, and in that single look, he understood that the woman who'd tucked him in at night was the same woman who'd carried wounded Marines through enemy fire. A VA nurse who'd been sitting quietly in the corner rose from her chair, her hands trembling as she pulled a file from her briefcase, the kind of file that doesn't exist in civilian hospitals, classified markings still visible despite decades of declassification review. She read aloud in a voice that shook with recognition. 2 tours, Kandahar, 2008 through 2012. Field Surgical Team Charlie. 47 combat evacuations. 3 Marines returned to duty who should have died in the dust. Each sentence was a hammer blow against the silence, and somewhere in that silence, Dr. Hargrove's fingers stopped their countdown drumming. Then the doors opened again, and a figure in navy dress whites entered, Commander Marcus Hayes, SEAL Team 3 Legacy, his uniform so immaculate it looked weaponized. He carried a leather document case, and when he opened it, his voice became the only sound in the room besides the air conditioning's whisper. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Watched. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. Another pause. The board members were leaning forward now, their papers forgotten. Navy Cross. For carrying 2 wounded Marines through sustained enemy fire across 400 meters of open ground, Jolan District, Fallujah, March 2004. He closed the case with deliberate precision. She was 26 years old. Dr. Hargrove's face drained of color, not the red-faced anger of a man caught breaking rules, but the gray-white pallor of a man watching his entire understanding collapse. He fell silent after the 4th commendation, his chair seeming to shrink around him, his posture folding like paper in rain. The hospital attorney beside him slid her chair 6 inches away, a gesture so small nobody commented on it, a gesture that spoke volumes. The board chair set down his pen, the click audible in the sudden quiet, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of federal authority. Mercy General Hospital is under investigation by the Department of Veterans Affairs for potential treatment discrimination against a protected veteran. This investigation is ongoing, and all parties will cooperate fully. He looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. Effective immediately, this disciplinary hearing is suspended pending federal review. The security guard who'd escorted Danielle out 2 weeks ago, a Marcus, promoted and reassigned to work with her on that first day, walked back into the conference room carrying a cardboard box. He set it on the table directly in front of Dr. Hargrove with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for bomb disposal. Inside were a stethoscope, a white coat, credentials, and the kind of documents that take years to accumulate. Marcus looked directly at the doctor with eyes that had seen combat, and his voice emerged flat and final. "Sir, I believe you know the way out." The room didn't move. Nobody breathed. The door closed behind Hargrove as he stood and walked toward it, his career trailing behind him like a shadow that would never quite catch up. By the next morning, the hospital had issued a statement expressing regret and commitment to supporting veteran healthcare providers. By the next week, Hargrove's medical privileges at Mercy General were permanently revoked pending a board review that everyone knew would end in termination. The Whisper Network did what the Whisper Network does, quiet, efficient, thorough, and within 2 weeks, 3 other hospitals in Raleigh had declined his applications without explanation. His malpractice insurance premiums tripled. His referral list evaporated. 6 months later, someone spotted him at Raleigh Community College teaching CPR certification to undergraduates, his minimum wage job turning him into exactly what he'd call Danielle, just a nurse with credentials, teaching basic life support to people who barely remembered his name. Nobody commented. He was already forgotten, already relegated to the kind of professional purgatory that comes from being caught, being exposed, being erased. But Danielle stood in the new veteran care wing at Mercy General, her senior chief insignia displayed in a frame beside her nursing license on the office wall. The brass plaque read Keating Veterans Health Center in letters so polished they reflected light like water. Her son stood beside her, his hand proud on her shoulder, finally understanding the mother he'd always known but had never really seen. Sarah Keating embraced her, tears sliding down her weathered face. Commander Hayes stood in dress uniform, and Sergeant Keating, his vision partially restored after the surgery he'd finally received, shook her hand at the ribbon-cutting ceremony with the grip of one warrior acknowledging another. The corpsman veteran and his wife worked the refreshment table. Marcus moved through the crowd in his new coordinator vest, his eyes tracking security with the kind of attention that comes from having served. During the ceremony, a young Marine arrived in a wheelchair, his left leg ending below the knee, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd been told no by 3 hospitals already. Danielle knelt beside him without being asked, and David watched his mother's hands move through the precise choreography of assessment and care, the same hands that had held stethoscopes and carried wounded through fire, that had refused to leave anyone behind, that had spent 18 years learning to be invisible so they could be available. She spoke with quiet authority that sounded nothing like pleading. "We're going to figure this out. You're not leaving here without answers." The young Marine's eyes filled with tears because nobody had said that to him in 3 months. The wall behind her displayed everything: her senior chief insignia, her nursing license, a photograph of her Kandahar unit, 23 faces arranged in desert camouflage, young and haunted and alive, and below them all, a small brass plaque inscribed with words Commander Hayes had arranged to be engraved the morning after the board meeting. It read simply, "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, if you've ever hidden who you really are to survive, if you've ever known someone carrying invisible medals in a pocket or under their scrubs, share this video. Subscribe. Comment what you would have done in Danielle's position. Veterans are walking among us, pushing mops, saving lives in the dark, teaching CPR to undergraduates, working quiet shifts where the only recognition is a saved life and a patient who still has their daughter's hand to hold. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be honored. They deserve to know that someone noticed.